Hello, welcome all. I'm Dan Twining, president of IRI. Thanks for taking the time to join us today for our launch event on our newly finalized white paper, which is called Democracy in the Age of Generative AI, Navigating Risks and Harnessing Opportunities. Here with my colleagues at IRI, I'm just very pleased to kick off this session to discuss such an important topic. Gen AI's impacts on democracy around the world and what we in the democracy, rights, and governance community can and should be doing about it. Since ChatGPT launched in late 2022 and generative AI became widely accessible to the public, there's been a lot of speculation about what impacts Gen AI might have, especially on political processes. IRI initially launched this line of work on Gen AI because we believe the DRG community needs to get ahead of understanding how this emerging technology will impact our partners and our work. We know that technology will never stop evolving and impacting the health of democracies in both positive and negative ways, so we need to make sure we aren't left behind playing catch-up. Generative AI, which is the focus of this report, can both empower and undermine democracy, can enhance civic engagement or amplify disinformation and polarization. It's influencing everything from media and information ecosystems to public discourse and electoral processes. The stakes are high, and it's crucial that policymakers, civil society, and technologists come together to shape responsible Gen AI development. IRI invested in the development of this white paper because we believe it's critical for democracy actors to understand how Gen AI might impact our governance systems and societies now and in the near future. The white paper includes a concrete analysis of Gen AI's impacts, including both risks and opportunities that IRI's partners and broader network of experts are already seeing and experiencing around the world. Most importantly, it contains a robust set of recommendations to help civil society, industry, and governments navigate this evolving landscape. In the next hour or so, our excellent team will provide an overview of the white paper, followed by a panel discussion with experts on Gen AI and its intersection with democracy. I'm really looking forward to that. We want this event to focus on what steps our democratic partners can take to ensure Gen AI enhances rather than harms democratic institutions. How can we collaborate to build an ecosystem that encourages Gen AI to be used as a tool for democratic actors to advance transparency, accountability, inclusion, and freedom of expression, rather than as a tool of surveillance, censorship, and oppression for autocratic ones? It's important we collectively answer this question because there's a lot at risk. Gen AI could impact public opinion and media integrity. It could obviously affect electoral processes. It could embolden bad actors to undermine democratic processes. And on the positive side, it could transform how governments deliver services. It's important to proactively consider these implications and to have a deep enough understanding of this technology to be able to parse out what is simply hype about generative AI from what is reality. Before I hand it off to my expert colleagues to provide a short overview of our white paper's contents, I do want to emphasize that the white paper is not a static document. It's a call for action. A cohesive movement for democratic Gen AI cannot be created by a white paper alone. We need continued dialogue, cross-sectoral collaboration, and responsible innovation to ensure that Gen AI serves and advances democratic values. I urge all of you today to engage with the insights presented here in the white paper and through our launch event to consider how all of us can contribute to ongoing efforts to align Gen AI's evolution with core democratic principles. Please do let us know if there are ways we can collaborate and support each other's work. It will take all of us gathered here in this virtual room, from industry and civil society to political parties and government institutions, to create frameworks, regulations, and ethical norms that ensure a rights-respecting use of Gen AI. I really do want to thank you all again for your participation in this event and for your commitment, which we share, to ensure that Gen AI strengthens rather than corrodes democracy and democratic institutions. With that, I'd like to hand it off to Wee Wee Oy, our advisor for technology and democracy here at IRI, for our great team, and Amanda Zink, our program manager on that team, to provide a high-level overview of the white paper and its contents. Thank you. Wee Wee, over to you.
Thanks, Dan. Sharing my screen now. Hopefully everyone can see it. All right. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here with us today. So before I get started, just a quick housekeeping note to share that the Q&A function is available at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. So if you have any questions during this presentation or just throughout the event, please just go ahead and type them out there, and then we will list them out later for our moderator, Jared. All right, so we want to use this time to provide an overview of our generative AI project and our very recently launched white paper. Amanda and I will provide a snapshot of our key findings, but we'll be keeping this very high level for the sake of time. And also, before we jump in, I want to flag a quick note up front that this entire project is focused specifically on generative AI and not AI more broadly, which is often called traditional AI. So generative AI is a subset of traditional AI that is specialized in creating new content like text, images, or videos based on learned patterns. And generative AI is what we're focusing in on this project. All right. So we launched this project early last year after ChatGPT became publicly available in 2022. So we began to actually receive a lot of questions from our partners and colleagues globally on this topic. And our goal for this project is to help understand, map, and also analyze the impacts that generative AI is currently and may soon have on democracy, focusing on the trends in the global south. We started the project with a landscape analysis and mapping interviews, but the main highlight of our programming has centered on convening a series of working group meetings through our Generative AI and Democracy Working Group. We convened this group over the past 9 months. It includes 30 plus academics, civil society, and also industry experts from around the world to help assess, map, understand the risks and opportunities that generative AI is really having on democracies globally. The work we completed with the working group culminated in the development of this white paper that synthesizes our findings and recommendations on Gen AI and its impacts on democracy. Our team actually was able to share some early findings and also receive feedback about the white paper at the Copenhagen Democracy Summit in May, TICTAC in June, and also the Peru AI Summit last month that was organized by the US and Peruvian governments. The English version of the white paper has been released earlier this month, and we are also in the process of completing the translation of it into both Spanish and French, which we will publish by the end of the month. Also, last thing before I move on to the next slide is that the main audience of the white paper is our traditional partners in the democracy, rights, and governance space. So civil society that are working on non-digital rights related issues such as anti-corruption, advocacy for women and youth, elections integrity, voter civic education groups, etc. And there are lower capacity on tech. Another group of people that we're looking to support are also local governments who are looking to leverage tech and beginning to look into AI. So our recommendations that Amanda will go into more later are meant to be broad, attainable, and also actionable for these actors. You'll see this QR code right here. So if you want to whip your phone out right now, if you haven't read our white paper or looked at it, you can take a picture of it and access the white paper on our website. All right. So as you can see, this slide is focused on the risks and opportunities. On the risk side, the key concerns, including from global North and South voices, are centered around the impacts to the information environment. So this includes an increased disinformation produced cheaper and faster, worsening hate speech and harassment, and also the overall distrust in the information environment that is increasing because of Gen AI. There are also many concerns about the lack of transparency in how Gen AI is developed, how it's being used, especially by governments, and how it's amplifying privacy concerns. Another major worry is the widening digital divide across gender, race, geography, language, etc. So those without the proper internet access, skills, and resources to use and leverage generative AI positively will fall further behind. We believe that Gen AI solutions can improve access and inclusion and level the playing field for participation in the digital and political space if the tools are deployed with intentionality and accompanied by proper policies. If not, it tends to lead to exacerbation of existing inequalities. This negative trend can lead to political campaigns, civil society actors, and individuals around the world continue to face accessibility gaps to using Gen AI tools. Our working group members also highlighted poor generative AI literacy as a concern, especially in legislatures, civil society, campaigns, and media in the global south, and also global north as well, actually. The lack of understanding and awareness contributes to just lower understanding of the risks or knowledge of existing risks and harms, and really hinders how these stakeholders do their work and how they leverage these tools for good. On the opportunity side of things, we heard a lot of potential positive applications, ranging from strengthening public service delivery to seeing a lot of hope for increasing accessibility, especially for multilingual content. And interestingly, while working group members are concerned about the impacts of information integrity, they also saw room for Gen AI to be leveraged to enhance fact-checking efforts and to help bolster trust and safety teams that are often and increasingly stretched thin. Another set of opportunities centered around how Gen AI could be leveraged by governments. This range from, number one, how governments could use Gen AI to translate information into a wide diversity of languages to increase transparency and accessibility of their information. To number two, which is using it to reduce barriers to citizen engagement by using Gen AI to power chatbots that will help citizens and users navigate complex policy or services in a more intuitive way. In the white paper, we also included interesting early case studies demonstrating a few examples of where things like this have started to be tested out. But of course, all these opportunities are contingent on rights respecting guardrails being put in place to ensure Gen AI tools is used democratically. So now I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Amanda, who was a co-drafter of this report as well, to talk through some of the recommendations that the report includes for different democratic stakeholders.
Thank you so much, Wee. I'm the program manager on the team and was a co-drafter in developing this white paper. So I'm really thankful to all of you for taking the time to join us. Like Wee said, I'm going to be walking through at a high level some of the recommendations that we distilled from our working group conversations. We developed 3 sets of recommendations for 3 distinct stakeholder groups that we see as key to ensuring generative AI helps rather than harms democracy. So that includes civil society, which you can see here, government and policymakers, which we'll move to next, and then finally industry. As a reminder, these recommendations are intended to be accessible for stakeholders around the world that may have lower capacity or resources to act. We especially tried to speak to actors in the global south with these recommendations. So I'm going to first focus on the recommendations we developed for civil society. As a quick note, in our white paper, we actually segment the recommendations for civil society into 2 buckets. One set with recommendations focused on guiding their own internal use of Gen AI, and another set more focused on work they could do to raise awareness and advocate around Gen AI's use. We didn't break the recommendations out that way on the slide, but when you go into the white paper, which hopefully you're looking at it now or will after this event, you will see that distinction. So for each of these stakeholder groups, I'm going to highlight very briefly just 2 quick recommendations to give you a little bit more context as to what we're getting at here and the types of content the white paper includes. First, I want to highlight our recommendation for civil society to develop internal Gen AI use policies to ensure they leverage Gen AI in responsible ways. We recommend they do so by referring to existing rights-based use frameworks to build off of to develop their own. So within the white paper, we provide much more nuanced guidance on how to take action on this recommendation. We suggest partners lean on existing frameworks, including guidance released by agencies already in the US, such as the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, which has released guidance on responsible internal use, or referring to existing global AI principles like those developed by the UN or the OECD to inform use policies for safe day-to-day use. We really want to encourage civil society to see the development of internal use frameworks as key to enabling positive, effective use cases internally, assisting in efforts to intentionally upskill and educate staff, and overall boosting accountability for civil society practices. The second recommendation I want to flag, and sort of dovetailing off of the one I was just mentioning, is our recommendation to develop an incident response plan, an IRP, that incorporates Gen AI use. We recommend this because establishing an IRP can help make sure civil society groups protect themselves and their partners from Gen AI harms. For organizations that already have an IRP or even cybersecurity measures, we recommend they evaluate how Gen AI threats can fit into those existing plans. But for organizations that don't have an IRP already, which based on our experience may be the majority of medium to small CSOs, we recommend that they refer to existing guidance to create their own. And we point partners specifically to general IRP guidance from the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, as well as to guidance from the International Association of Privacy Professionals, which have published really useful steps to follow when AI systems have caused harm. So there are already really great resources out there. And for these two recommendations and for all others in the white paper, we provide links to the examples I'm referencing as templates that partners can directly begin building off of. All right, next slide. So moving on to the second stakeholder group here, this slide is focused on recommendations for government and decision makers. Please note that these recommendations could be implemented by different elements of government, such as public-facing benefit agencies or by legislators focused on developing regulations, to name a few. How these recommendations are applied can really depend on what function of government is considering taking action. So similarly, I'm going to just briefly highlight two recommendations here for your attention. The first recommendation I want to highlight is to involve citizen feedback at all stages of generative AI integration. This includes creating opportunities for citizens to weigh in before, during, and even after a Gen AI tool is integrated. This should be a best practice for governments launching really any type of digital tool, but we think it's even more important when integrating Gen AI. We need to make sure citizens are aware of what their government is doing and are given the opportunity to share feedback to ensure citizen needs are properly met and that generative AI integration is needed and useful. This process can be done through town halls, virtual feedback forms, public surveying, and even user testing once a government is moving forward with integration. We simultaneously recommend that governments take steps to transparently and proactively share information about how AI is integrated. A few suggestions we provide include labeling government content that has been informed or developed by Gen AI, or publishing fairness and privacy criteria government uses to procure commercially developed Gen AI products, to name just a few. The second recommendation I really want to flag for all of you is the recommendation that there should be evaluations of how government is regulating or auditing industry tools and actions related to generative AI. We include this because we feel strongly that government should take action to establish oversight mechanisms to protect the rights of citizens. This could include requiring regulatory agencies to evaluate laws that are already in place to determine whether or how they might be able to apply to generative AI development, deployment, and use, and issuing guidance to provide clarity for businesses and even civil society on what appropriate and inappropriate use cases are. Other options for government include establishing third-party auditing systems to evaluate Gen AI tool implications in government, and issuing requests for information that actually invite businesses, civil society, and citizens to give feedback on Gen AI-related questions to help inform an agency's future regulatory rulemaking. All right, so jumping to the next and final stakeholder group here, I'm going to just very briefly cover recommendations for industry. And when we say industry, we're specifically targeting private sector companies like social media platforms and Gen AI developers with this set of recommendations. So the first one I want to highlight here is the recommendation to build capacity among industry professionals on ethical, legal, and societal implications of Gen AI. The first goal of this recommendation is to encourage industry to invest time and resources in educating developers about the implications, the broader implications of Gen AI. Doing so can create more informed multidisciplinary teams that are more able to build products and services in line with human rights and democratic principles, and with a stronger understanding of differences in accessibility and usability of generative AI in different contexts, including between global north and global south countries that likely will require different harm mitigation efforts. The second goal of this recommendation is to encourage companies to publicly share their deployment, development, and use policies. Publicly sharing these standards can create a positive cycle to help set industry standards and even incentivizes other companies to develop and publish their own set of ethical design principles. This can also boost accountability by making these standards public, because civil society organizations can refer to company guidance to identify gaps in industry practices and to inform their own advocacy work as well. The final recommendation that I want to highlight to you all is that industry should provide sustainable long-term funding for civil society and academic partners in the larger AI space. We really encourage industry to especially seek to support civil society and academic partners outside of the global north. Funding like this could go towards supporting research, advocacy, and even training activities that are likely to actually help industry to minimize the harms that their own tools may pose. These efforts could go towards even joint collaboration between industry and civil society or industry and academia to develop solutions to Gen AI concerns and threats. So it could be mutually beneficial for industry and for civil society. Through these contributions, leaders in industry could have a really significant role in creating responsible AI ecosystems and could help reverse some of the recent funding cuts that have impacted the digital rights ecosystem that's so critical to informing responsible Gen AI development. So with that, that is a very brief, very high-level overview of just some of the great recommendations that we included. For all of the recommendations that were on the screen we didn't touch on, we have more detailed guidance and recommendations associated with them. But before I close out and we move into the panel portion of this event, we did want to take a moment to highlight a final chapter within the white paper that's focused on looking ahead and trying to help our civil society, industry, and other partners really think about what to anticipate. We wanted to include this more forward-looking section because we know if our democracy partners are to be at all prepared to effectively regulate, advocate, educate, or anything else, they need to be thinking ahead about the future, what the longer-term impacts may emerge, how they may emerge, given how fast generative AI is evolving. So for the sake of time, again, I'm not going to go into detail into all of these, but I just want to flag two quick themes that were really coming up in our working group and we're hearing from our partners time and again. First, we heard a lot of concern about the realities that might emerge if regulation, specifically privacy regulation, does not keep up. We heard fears about a future where data gathering runs unchecked, where citizens' privacy is violated, and where surveillance is enabled with few limitations. This includes both in democratic and authoritarian spaces that these concerns exist if regulation is not advanced. The other future impact or reality that I want to highlight here was anticipation for a world where Gen AI use and development is much more diversified. This can result in both positive and negative outcomes. For example, increasing access to no-code tools, which are much easier for lower skilled individuals to use, could really democratize access to Gen AI and increase access to communities that lack the technical skills to build AI tools from scratch. On the flip side, though, this could also result in an explosion of Gen AI tools that is largely unchecked. This reflects a vision of the future where we're overwhelmed by tons of low-quality tools or even overwhelmed by a large number of tools that are being used for nefarious purposes. Small companies may be just trying to make a profit from authoritarian governments to develop many new tools at a very rapid pace. So this is really a reality that many of our working group members were concerned about. And it's very likely that the Gen AI landscape will become increasingly complex and difficult to track. So those are just two quick themes. Like I said, we go into detail on all the others that are up on the screen. And all of this that Hui and I just ran through is a very high-level overview of some of the really great content we included. So we do encourage you all to take time to read through it, to share it with your networks, with your partners, and please reach out to us if you'd like to engage on this topic or have any questions. So thank you so much for listening. This concludes the presentation portion of our event. So I'm now going to hand it off to Jared Ford, the Director for Technology and Democracy at IRI, who is going to moderate and facilitate our panel discussion. Jared, over to you.
Thanks so much, Amanda, and thank you, Hui, for that amazing overview. And also thanks to Dan Twining, our president, for the kickoff and scene setting. And for all joining us today, I hope that much of the content my colleagues have shared inspires you to read through the white paper in more detail. This analysis and overview of recommendations are just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the guidance included. If you're looking for direction on what to do today to better equip yourself and your organization to navigate and influence the evolving generative AI landscape, the white paper is a great place to start. I'm going to serve as the moderator for today's expert panel discussion, which will dive more deeply into the real-world impacts that generative AI is already having on democracies around the world. The discussion will include what steps experts encourage key democratic stakeholders to take and what they should avoid. Much of the panel discussion will reflect the recommendations and use cases we included in the white paper to map what we in the DRG community should be doing to ensure that generative AI meets its potential for good while mitigating the harms. Before we jump in, I wanted to lay out a few housekeeping rules. As was the case during the presentation of the white paper, you have the option to submit questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please note that we will make time at the end of the panel conversation to address questions from the audience, so I encourage you to submit questions throughout the discussion. We'll do our best to get to as many as possible before the event's conclusion. With that said, I'd like to introduce our exciting set of panelists, two of whom were members of our Generative AI and Democracy Working Group and who helped inform much of its content. First, I'd like to introduce Nicholas Badoum. Nicholas is a senior project manager at Democracy X, a nonprofit civil society organization based in Denmark, seeking to address technological acceleration and the need for democratic empowerment and innovation. Nicholas has a decade of experience in technology assessment projects, including planning, implementing, and coordinating national and international citizen and stakeholder participation processes in responsible and trustworthy AI, data protection, neurotechnology, and more. He was also a member of our working group. Second, I'd like to introduce Lavina Ramkissoon. She serves as a technology and data expert for the UN University Center for Policy Research, is an advisor for the Africa Union on the topics of technology and the economy, and is an ambassador for the Responsible AI Network in Africa. She advocates for conscious technology integration and has driven work to unlock Africa's immense potential through technology. Lavina was also part of our Generative AI and Democracy Working Group. Finally, I'd like to introduce Rebecca Tyne. She is a leader in trust and safety, specializing in the intersection of responsible AI, societal well-being, and the digital information ecosystem. As the head of commercial operations, trust and safety at Blackbird AI, she spearheads efforts related to election integrity and the detection of digital threats. Previously, Rebecca has led critical programs at global social media companies, focusing on misinformation, crisis response, and election integrity during pivotal events such as the Brazil and US elections. Rebecca is a facilitator for the Trust and Safety Consortium at the Stanford Internet Observatory and an affiliate with All Tech is Human, where she leads initiatives on cyber and democracy. I could go on for even longer about our esteemed panelists, but I'd like you to hear from them. So we're going to jump right into it. Thanks to all three of you for taking the time to be here. Now I'm going to open it up with some questions for our panelists. Starting with Nicholas, as a member of our working group, you brought insightful knowledge to the table from the perspective of civil society, including lessons learned on the role civil society can and should play in tackling one of the critical concerns we identified: low public awareness and education on generative AI's risks and opportunities. So for you, I'd like to ask, what best practices can you share from the Danish Board of Technology's experience, especially that you think might apply to Global South actors, both on how civil society actors can first be educating themselves on this topic, and also how CSOs can inform and engage citizens on the risks and opportunities that generative AI presents?
Thanks, Jared, and thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to have been part of this working group. So I'll dive right in. I think for CSOs, it's really important to remember to conceive of generative AI as at once a tool and an object of analysis. So in terms of a tool, simply get your fingers dirty and appropriate the technology. And by that, I mean, learn how this technology can actually benefit your constituency. There's a lot of examples. I'll take one from Denmark. It's called Be My Eyes. It's a generative AI-driven app that can help blind people actually experience the environment by the app describing what is happening around it. And it's a good example of how generative AI can actually enhance the lives of people who have other difficulties in life, right? So I think, first of all, upskill your own staff to understand the technology, learn what's out there, and then upskill your constituency first and foremost. And then I think, secondly, once you're in that process, also investigate the ways in which the technology can pose harm or have negative impacts on your constituency. So in the same way, talking about discrimination, bias, or if you're a labor market organization or a union, looking at the risks of technological displacement of labor forces, right? So having both this conception of what can you actually do with the technology, but also how it can adversely impact you, will then enable you to much more strategically apply the technology and campaign for political change. So that's at your first question there, Jared. Secondly, I think when we're talking about informing citizens and engaging them, information campaigns are fine and they're important, but when they can only do so much to foster reflection. So I think it's really important, first of all, to empower citizens with resources, training resources that are targeted to different types of population groups. But I think it's also extremely important to overcome the knowledge deficit model, which by and large states that you cannot give citizens influence on a technology that they do not really understand, which we've seen time and time again. If you actually engage people in meaningful, substantial engagement, you can have leverage these people's voices and give them influence in democratizing technological development. And I think it's particularly important here to also engage citizens in conversations about the positive futures that we can conceive with generative AI, right? Right now, it's very easy to look at all the nightmare scenarios of what it will mean, but it's really important, if we actually want to drive the technology towards something that we do want, that we also start rehearsing a vocabulary for things that we really do want instead. So those are my opening answers, I would say.
Thank you, Nicholas. Yeah, appreciate everything shared there. It's pretty striking, the framework of looking at generative AI as an instrument and an object. I love the idea of rehearsing positive futures. So hopefully we can dig into those elements soon. I want to turn to Lavina. You're also coming from the civil society perspective and have been tracking generative AI use cases across the African continent. Can you share a bit about what you're seeing in terms of responsible use and what approaches or factors led to those positive use cases?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jared. I think, from a application perspective, there's obviously the fun and cool stuff, and then those that actually shift the needle in terms of making a difference, right? So maybe let's start with the fun and cool stuff and then work our way down to, the ones that actually make impact. So I think we've seen, given the continent itself being very immersed in terms of language and diversity in that language, the uptake of chatbots has definitely been, seen widely sort of used and adopted. But I think interestingly enough, it's actually been sort of adapted into the creative arts industry space. So, in terms of utilization for storytelling, movies, short clippets, or, whether it be music, Those are the sort of areas that we're seeing, an unusual sort of uptake. And I thought it would be fun to mention that, just given the, sort of magnitude of that industry at large. I think if we had to delve into, the sort of other areas of it, we've seen, for example, within the likes of agriculture, particularly in Uganda and Kenya, some examples around how it is being utilized. One interesting sort of application from a Nigerian perspective has been with the development of the first humanoid first African humanoid, and the applications that then surround that. Another has been in terms of a South African aspect that has literally seen, both from an educational perspective, it being adopted, but also equally so from a e-government services perspective. So, it being ingrained from a municipal level, and people then being able to utilize and understand government and their services much wider and larger. If I had to kind of go into the regions of Ghana, that was probably where we saw a lot of financial inclusion kind of, uptake. So that was from education awareness of finance all the way through to actual utilization of the products. And if I had to go to the likes of, Egypt as an example, there we kind of saw a large uptake of smart cities and applications in terms of how can we promote that particular sort of area. And then I'll probably end with a bit of one from Tanzania. So, particularly with them, it was about environmental monitoring and climate monitoring. So, that was quite an interesting one. And then the last one, which I found of most value, was in the most recent cases, there was flooding in Morocco. I think that happened in February. And, again, it was voice generated, and utilized in terms of notes, and then being able to dispatch help as well as whatever aid was actually required to people on ground. So, I think that for me was the one that probably stood out the most as being most impactful in a time of need. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea. I do know that it is very dispersed in terms of how Africa is adopting it. But I think, it actually goes to show that there is very different requirements on ground, either from a need perspective, and, each country has its own need, sort of demand at that point in time, that then helps to emerge. But it does showcase quite a large variety of things that are actually happening on ground at this point in time. And a lot of it is actually value-driven or need-driven at this point in time.
Thank you. Yeah, that's absolutely stunning. The sort of diversity of use cases, arts, economy, education, government, emergency response, and being demand-driven, I think is essential for understanding how this is evolving. Appreciate your thoughts there. I'm going to throw it over to Rebecca now. Rebecca, I wanted to bring you in here to share more about the tech industry perspectives. You've been tracking trends across the tech industry on how companies are approaching the risks and opportunities generative AI presents. Can you share an overview on the themes you're seeing and how companies are trying to tackle or minimize risk? Are you seeing themes or promising approaches emerge to the development of guardrails or safe use policies?
Thank you, Jared. And can you hear me all right? Good. I'd be happy to jump in, talk about some of the themes that we're seeing. First and foremost, I want to call out that the use of generative AI increases the landscape of dis and misinformation narratives. And it's important to note that not only does this pose a significant risk to society and democracy, but it also has financial and reputational harms to companies. So it is in industry's best interest to have safeguards in place. And this is especially true when it comes to democratic processes. In the year of elections, we have seen examples of how AI-enabled disinformation have weaponized and tried to disrupt electoral integrity. Some examples that I think of are India, Venezuela, we had Mexico, and here we really saw deepfakes become tools for narrative attacks and really try to get individuals to distrust the civic process. And these examples underscore how disinformation and misinformation doesn't just manipulate the facts, but it really does and can polarize a society. Something internally that we often talk about is online harms can lead to offline harms. So it's important that, we remember that, especially within the industry. So given the risks that I kind of just went over, there are some encouraging things that I have seen, some promising approaches within the industry. And even just the last year. Specifically, some things that I want to talk about is about how we are seeing the integration of AI safety by design directly into product development life cycles. It's something especially at larger industries, let's think platforms, who are more operationally set up to support that. They have this already being incorporated within their design approach. We also are seeing companies conduct internal red teaming exercises, as well as using a crowdsourced intelligence approach where they are going into different communities and groups to try to help identify vulnerabilities in AI systems. A local company that's been really great at this is Humane Intelligence, and they've been going around globally to run these exercises. There's been a growing emphasis on creating that assessment and evaluation framework. I think a year ago, it was who's going to do this? What are we going to do? And now I see a lot of recommendations coming from many people. So there's definitely an opportunity for us to convene and make sure that we're doing a standard. Best practice, however, we are seeing those frameworks start to develop, which is, at least promising. And then, of course, another emerging trend that I think the white paper covers really well and that I've heard here today already is around that transparency and explainability in AI. What this means is that when we're developing systems to flag harmful content, let's say, we are starting to see the developer side provide context around how things are built. But then on the other side, we're seeing users, people who are engaging with these technologies, providing feedback. There's a feedback loop starting to develop that's really promising. And they are starting to help provide insights into why content would be particularly problematic in one area versus another. So those are some things that have happened. And I think we're in a really promising place. I mean, coming from someone who worked in platforms, it's you can never be prepared enough, especially as it comes to civic events like elections. However, it is promising to see all of these different stakeholders come together and information share and come up with the best way forward in a collective manner.
Rebecca, thank you so much. That's actually quite heartening. I appreciate the look at the current view on steps as promising. And you mentioned several different techniques there. So possibly we can delve into one or two soon. Feedback loops, safety by design. These are, I think, excellent lessons learned from the industry. All right, I want to turn it back to Nicholas and Lavina. I know you've both been engaging with governments on regulatory concerns related to generative AI. We all know that government is a key stakeholder in all of this. How government does or does not regulate this rapidly evolving technology is going to shape the impacts that generative AI has on democracy and democratic processes. So with that in mind, can you both speak to what legislative and or regulatory measures government should prioritize to address the risks of generative AI and democracy? And if possible, can you share any positive steps or strong examples of where governments or governing bodies are showing early signs of getting this right? I'm going to throw it to Lavina this time since we started with Nicholas last time.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much for that, Jared. So I'll probably, kind of answer the question or both the questions with examples that will hopefully cover what should or shouldn't be, being covered by governments at large. I think if we look at a global perspective, we've obviously seen the likes of the EU with the AI Act. That really showcases quite a strong message in terms of transparency and accountability and high-risk applications of AI, which again, I think the white paper speaks to. If we had a look at the US, there was a very high focus on deepfake legislation that kind of took place. If we look at the UK, it was very much around online safety. An example of Asia could be Singapore in terms of, their adaptation of, protection of personal information. If we kind of look at, the sort of African continent at large, I think when we talk about data privacy and policies, that has been largely adopted within the space of, I think, about 3 to 4 years. So pre-COVID, we kind of had about 6 countries. To date, we probably have around 40 odd countries out of 56 that have already adopted it and legislated it. So that's quite a large, significant portion. The area of, transparency, accountability, content moderation that kind of focuses around misinformation and disinformation has all been included into those data privacies and policies. However, there is a large drive of having an AI policy itself. So we have one country on the continent that has a policy at large, being Rwanda. We have about 8 or 9 others that have some form of a strategy in place that will soon equate into a policy. We have around maybe 13 or 14 that are currently actively working towards having an AI policy. So again, within the space of about a year and a half, we've seen quite a large growth in terms of, having the focus on just not AI, but AI and ethical applications or AI and responsible applications. And I think it kind of largely starts with, the campaigns around, privacy, public awareness, and education at large. And I'll hand it over to Nicholas to add more.
Thank you, Lavina. So I might go a little less concretely at this and maybe start at a more abstract level of theory, where there's in innovation theory the idea that boundary setting for innovation doesn't actually create less innovation per se, but there's a very big probability that you will actually create better innovation that is more suitable for society and more in line with what the values living in society are. And if you look at it very concretely, it also means that if you create clarity and predictability for companies, they know what playing field they have to operate within, and it gives them security long term to create the innovations and make the investments in these innovations long terms. And the flip side of that, obviously, is that you're also better able to provide consumer side transparency in terms of what are the legislations that these AI systems are actually adhering to. And obviously, you need to provide all of this also with enforceable rights and rights to redress and all of these things. And I think a really important part of that for governments is to provide hands-on practice-oriented guidance for companies, particularly SMEs that often struggle with how are we going to translate, for instance, the EU AI Act, which is an immensely complex legislation. How do we translate that into practice in our company, right? So the government can also do a lot by actually helping and guiding particularly SMEs, but industry at large. And in doing that, I think it's really important that the government also includes resources for ethical reflection, for trustworthiness, And all of these elements that we keep talking about, I think government here has an obvious opportunity to actually help guide and steer companies in that direction. And then I would say research and development funding is a really strong opportunity for governments here as well. For funding going to trustworthy and human-centered development. But first and foremost, governments need to be demonstrating what it means to create trustworthy AI and responsible AI. So government also has a role here. And I know Denmark, for instance, the different governmental agencies are still figuring out what does it mean to have generative AI, right? And maybe if we are to pick a little at the global north here, you can say, well, in Denmark, we don't actually have overarching guidelines for public agency of governmental agencies of how should they apply. Each agency is actually responsible for developing their own guidelines, their own rules, and their own procedures, which is immensely ineffective, but probably also not really the best way to go about it. And we're seeing the same throughout different sectors of public institutions, for instance, in the educational sector. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. No, I appreciate both responses, both the tangible examples and then the sort of theoretical frameworks that apply. Rebecca, you might have thoughts on that question, but I'm going to pose another one to you and you can decide which ones you want to answer. So back on industry perspectives, one thing we recommend in the report is that industry should create space to collaborate with civil society and policymakers. I think you referenced a couple of examples of that in your first sharing. But that space should be created to foster a rights-respecting, responsible Gen AI community. So it's a multilateral conversation. From your experience, what would you encourage industry to do to make sure diverse voices, especially from the global South, are heard? And do you have any positive examples or approaches you can share?
Yeah, thank you, Jared. Ensuring that diverse voices, particularly from the global South, being included in AI development is crucial to make it obviously more equitable, but also unbiased. One way the industry can achieve it is by developing and curating localized data sets that capture the linguistics, cultural, societal, and democratic nuances that are local to a region. When I worked at platforms, it was the most complicated thing was the cultural context, was understanding the language. I was not an expert in, global democracy and how the various countries have different rules and the way that they participate in the electoral process. So that is one thing that I think would be very beneficial. Another important aspect is around data sovereignty. As we talk about data privacy, I think something we often overlook, especially as we're talking about AI development, is making sure that as these systems and tools are developed, that the data collected from the global South is managed in a way that not only is respectful of the rights and interests of the local communities, but also ensuring that they understand what data is going in and how it's training models. So that's an important aspect that I feel like industry could be helpful with. And then I'm biased and there are some negatives to this, but I'm a big believer that open source AI is another promising approach. And the reason being is because I feel like it gives greater transparency, but then subsequently it enables people locally to develop and modify tools to best suit their needs. However, how do they do that? Some things that I've seen already that are very promising is around coalition building. There are forums, like I am an affiliate through All Tech is Human. They have an AI, responsible AI group of over 4,000 global members that contribute and provide, insights and lean on each other for, different items, whether it be about design or use. So coalition building is huge. And I feel like after the big sweep of layoffs across trust and safety. Within the platforms, we have seen people more distributed across different industries and sectors. So it's been interesting to get diverse perspectives in that way as well. Another thing that I would call out here is around upskilling. Education on AI tools and systems. When I first took a course in 2017 on AI, I was like, this is wild. This will never, and here we are, right? And it's amazing how far we've come in such a short amount of time. But it's also important to call out that there are companies within the industry that want to provide free programs through Google, Harvard, IBM, Intel, Penn. That's the program I went through that I previously paid for. It's now free. So you can go out online and find some really good resources and take some classes. So I would encourage everyone within this group, but within the different pillars across the different stakeholder groups, encourage that everyone go and take these classes while they're free. Who knows how long that will last? So that's something that's very promising. And then the last thing I'm going to call out here is that there needs to be pressure on the industry to attend cross-sector conferences. The first one that I attended that really opened my eyes after working in the industry was RightsCon. Being able to sit with civil society organizations and hear back from these other stakeholders in a forum where you just listen and learn was very beneficial. However, this industry doesn't usually pay for their employees to go to a conference that's outside their work remit. So if we could find creative ways to engage them and have them participate in more of these civil society planned conferences and forums, that's really important. And then the other one, like I said, cost should never be a barrier to understanding. Just like this conference today was free, we need to see more stuff like this to educate people. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Jared.
Thank you. Yeah, practical examples. Shout out to RightsCon this year in Taiwan, which I think will also be pretty compelling. And yeah, thanks for being very definitive and granular with your recommendations. I'm going to take a moment to remind the audience, this is your chance to weigh in with your questions. We've got a couple in already, but if anyone else wants the opportunity, please add it in the Q&A. And I'm actually going to wrap my last question. This is going to be a popcorn style. So we'll go around the room and give each of you a chance to answer this last one from me. So for all of you, and this sort of leans into one of IRI's strong areas, which is civil society advocacy. So we know that advocacy can play a big role in shaping the narrative and ultimately key decision makers' actions. So with that in mind, how would you recommend civil society to effectively advocate for ethical use and/or design of generative AI? And if someone wanted to raise their hand and just jump in, you can be the first one to go.
I can go first. So at an industry level, civil society can help support startups and smaller companies. By this, I mean, oftentimes when you're going after funding to secure your next round, you're strapped for resources, or you often lack the expertise required in tech policy to set up your own internal trust and safety policies. So I think it's important that we try to engage with the startups in this space and the smaller platforms that are blossoming to make sure that they are putting these safeguards in place and building things responsibly. And then another thing that I will say is that it's important that we foster collaboration between the different sectors and create a more unified AI-enabled, positive direction forward. Something that I struggle with within the industry, but more broadly within technology, is so often we don't align on our terminology, the language we use to describe the various systems or tools or impacts. We use variable words, which already makes it more complicated to then translate it to anywhere else. So I think it's important that we do a standardization exercise, like this acronym does this. And the white paper does start out with a page of acronyms, and I loved that. But making sure that we align on how we are defining those terms, I think is very important. In my world at Blackbird, an actor is not the same thing as an actor in this paper. An actor would be someone who is propagating some sort of campaign for harm, versus here, it's all of us. So I think it's important that we recognize that the terminology is different, and we try to do our best on aligning on that. Expanding beyond the stakeholders that are in this group, and I know it's hard. We have to like group people and try to provide our recommendations in a way that we can understand it. But I do feel that there is an opportunity for us to expand. Specifically, someone that I often feel is missing from the room is ad tech. And I don't know who that is or what that representation would look like, but they're a big key player in this. And I feel like by involving more sectors that we are using to get data from or that are building systems, that will be a more helpful approach. So I think putting pressure on these forums, these convening where we're like, who should be here? We really target some of the people that are missing from the room, not only within the industry, but also globally within different, regions to make sure that we are inclusive of all different areas.
Thank you. Lavina, I think you're off mute.
Yeah, I'll probably want to add one or two thoughts to that. So, from a global South perspective, I think there's also some pre-layers that need to be addressed, right? So things like your digital divide, things like accessibility, connectivity, those become really critical issues. So one is the tech itself, which is great and awesome. But like, in Rebecca's example of industry, I would say, I would push industry to also ensure that, for example, if we're talking about, a telco in particular, allow certain startups, to go and put in a last mile sort of delivery to connectivity. Allow those things to start happening just because you may not particularly have an interest or because it doesn't serve from a profit perspective or from a capitalist perspective. It becomes one where you can allow others to then actually drive that narrative on your behalf, as an example. Right. So whether it's Wi-Fi implementation or, fiber, whatever the case may be. And I think one other aspect for me would be like around government. So if we had to, one thing is having regulations and legislations in place. The other is then obviously enforcing that, which is the key sort of factor. So, even having like an oversight body, that is monitoring and establishing, are these standards actually being adhered? Are they, within sort of realm? Just something that kind of oversees what is happening on a sort of ground level, post certain of these applications or innovations that are coming out, or even post some of the policies, right, that are there. So those are the two areas that I would probably add from a need base within the continent. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. So in terms of CSOs, I think one of the first things really to do is to clearly showcase what the potential implications of generative AI can be, not in a hype style way, but actually show what it can be on a day-to-day basis for completely regular people, to get them to also understand what is it that we're actually talking about, both in terms of the potential negative impacts, but also obviously the positive impacts. At least from a Danish perspective right now, when we're talking about government application of AI, it's very rudimentary. But even at that level, you have replication of errors if something is wrong at an enormous speed, right? So alone that as an example of what does it mean if you apply AI or generative AI in the wrong way, could be a way of showcasing very clearly what it means when we're talking about the potential harms of this. And by the same token, the other way around, showing what can we actually gain from this if we do it the right way around. So being able to talk into both of those narratives, I think, is really important to gain political traction as a CSO. I think I completely want to second what you said, Rebecca, about language barriers. We're part of some research projects, and very concrete example is the notion of trustworthiness, meaning something completely different, whether you're an engineer sitting looking at standardizations and system integrity and things like that, or whether you're a lawyer looking at trustworthiness under different legal frameworks, or if you're a social sciences and humanities professional looking at it from a completely different, more social angle, right? So the terminology, I agree, is pivotal here. Then I think finding allies, both within industry and policy, is extremely important, because it sort of goes to what you're also saying, Rebecca, right? Coalition building. So going out and finding out who are your allies within this field, who can act also as multiplier organizations for you. And then I would say strategic engagement of citizens and stakeholders to show policymakers, regulators, decision makers that there is some kind of popular opinion pointing in some direction. What we can see when doing citizen engagement around AI and generative AI is that people generally want the technology, but they have certain reservations towards it, right? So you also need to be able to showcase these things that you actually have gone out and engaged with your constituency and the general population as a way of having a leverage when you're talking to policymakers.
Thank you. And three totally different perspectives. So I appreciate the variety of strategies you're putting on the table here for our audience. This is the time where we're going to revert over to audience questions. So I'm going to open this up and work through what has come in so far. And for folks in the room, feel free to continue submitting your questions. I think we'll just have whoever of our panelists wants to weigh in. Maybe you can put your hand up and we can jump over to you. Otherwise, I'll move on to the next question coming in, since we have a couple of them. All right, so this is the first one. Are there any recommendations for how we go about addressing inclusivity for the marginalized and disabled, especially in rural sectors, in the use of responsible Gen AI? You may also, and this is my expansion of the question, these marginalized communities can also be disproportionately harmed by generative AI. So welcome thoughts about keeping those communities centered in this process. Go ahead, Lavina.
Yes, I'll probably, kind of add some thought processes to that. So if we, took the example that I shared earlier on in terms of, access to the tech itself, right? If we had to look at it from a industry perspective, or maybe perhaps we start from a civil. If we had to go on that level, it's really around how do we advocate and how do we have campaigns enough in terms of that itself, but also how do we have enough vehicles in place to then best support these particular programs and resources that are then there. If we had to look at, a government stance to this, it is really just around, policy and investments, right? And ensuring that those two things are in place so that industry can then apply the necessary technologies on it, to create access as well as to support that growth in industry. And marginalized communities are everywhere. And it is also, like these sort of forums, making sure that there is representation, and having, a conversation with a larger audience, one. And I think if you are an industry player, then it is also ensuring that those that are building the tech itself are diverse enough. It's not only necessarily just the data itself or the data sets. It also boils down to, the people within the organization, or, the wider group that you're sort of attracting to it. There's obviously, other areas of, consideration, but those are definitely the top key ones that come to mind in that particular example.
Thank you, Lavina. Over to you, Rebecca.
I don't know how to raise my hand in Zoom, so my apologies. Okay. So something that comes to mind here, exactly as Lavina was saying, is around, the educational piece, the digital literacy. I think that it's not even just respective to AI, but just in general internet use, especially around accessibility, right? So like a lot of companies that the information that AI systems are built on are, online systems, open source, that you can scrape from the internet. And I think it's important to take a step back to like Internet 101 and really make sure that people, especially those who maybe are intellectually disabled or have any sort of developmental disabilities or physical disabilities, are included in like some sort of media literacy. Something that I think we often forget about is like when we use the internet, we agree to terms of service and we just scroll to the bottom. And I think making sure people understand what they are agreeing to, because, if it's free, then you are the product. So just making sure that people are aware of what they're doing online and how that further feeds into the systems. But then subsequently making sure that, and was a big thing when I worked in the platforms, making sure that even the output of these systems are accessible, whether it be based on color blindness, based on being deaf or vision impaired, just making sure that we are taking those extra steps to make sure that everyone can participate and use these, I think is very important. And I think it starts further back than just with the AI system. I think we need to take a step back and focus more on like digital literacy.
That's excellent. Yeah, thanks for sort of figuring out what the root causes here and what the infrastructural solutions might be. I'm actually wanting to build off that answer because we have another question, which I think reflects our audience and the fact that IRI primarily works in the Global South. This is sort of a digital divide question. So we can build off of what Rebecca just shared for others. What are some successful ways, in the panel's opinion, to help people in the Global South access and use AI technology despite limited infrastructure? And how potentially might global private sector or local CSOs work together to make this happen? This is sort of an international development question, but there are also other actors that have responsibilities there. Nicholas or Lavina, I don't know if you have any initial thoughts before Rebecca might want to weigh back in.
Nicholas, do you want to go or should I? Okay, thanks. So I think, some of the examples that definitely stand out is, if, for example, people don't necessarily have I guess not all smartphones are equal. So, an example of that is, the creation of USSD codes, which is widely used within the context of Africa to then allow an extension. It may not be the full utilization, but it is an extension where people can get some sense of access to that. I think the example that I sort of rendered earlier in terms of the Morocco floodings, that was literally done via WhatsApp, voice orientated, it was a plugin, an API, blah, blah, and it was literally, executed and sort of mass helped people. There are lots of different ways that we can look at things. If we're looking from an agricultural perspective, there's a lot of satellites that are available that offer you offline data, as an example, when you're looking at things like crop yielding or predictions or, weather patterns and the rest of it. So I think there is somewhat of access to the sort of offline version, world as such. Those are the ones that just kind of come to mind at this point in time. But I'm sure there are a lot more, things that are being required. So, for example, Africa kind of mass adopted mobile sort of wallets and payments as an example. And I'm sure we'll see something like that will come about, that will bridge that gap where, infrastructure lacks, but there is innovation that is trying to really succumb that to that degree.
Thank you, Lavina. Nicholas, I'm happy to jump on to the next question unless you want to jump in here. All right. We are fast approaching the end, so I'm going to combine 2 remaining questions into one and have another popcorn round to wrap us up before I share some closing remarks. So this is sort of a 2-part. The first part is, so you saw my colleagues, one of the last slides was anticipating future trends. So we're looking ahead and can prepare stakeholders for eventual realities. So I wanted to ask from your perspective, and you might repeat one of those future trends, but what future challenges do you anticipate as generative AI technology continues to evolve? So that's sort of part A. And then possibly related, is there one recommended action for a stakeholder? So you could choose civil society, industry, or government to take to advance responsible use, potentially in response to that challenge. So that's sort of a 2-part. I can give you a couple of seconds to think about it, and then we can wrap up hearing from everyone.
So I can go first. I think in terms of the future challenges, one of the first things that I want to highlight is arranging our educational system to actually take heed of what generative AI means for learning. So far, our educational system is by and large designed around home assignments and things like that. And our language classes are also based on the fact that you don't have an immediate answer necessarily, and all of a sudden you kind of do, and you don't really have to write your home assignment. You could just ask a very advanced generative AI to do it. So I think education is in and of itself a challenge, working out how to do it intelligently and not just shut our eyes and say it's not happening. And I think in that there is a challenge potentially, or a risk in terms of deep knowledge and reflection in an age where you could just ask an AI to summarize a 500-page book, right? That you're tasked with reading in your university class. You could just ask ChatGPT to do it. But what is the consequence of continually using a tool to compromise the entire learning effort to a single prompt? Recommendation for one actor. I have a lot of recommendations, but I think in terms of governments, I would say beyond what I already said, I think governments need to remember that they have a really powerful muscle in the tenders that they make, public tenders for public procurement. There's a really significant muscle that can be utilized by creating requirement specifications for these tenders to make the products that we actually do want to see in a democratic society.
That's excellent. Thank you. Nodding my head vigorously. Rebecca, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so, and the question was 2-part. One was about the challenges, but then like what would I recommend as an immediate action? So some challenges that I see ahead specifically would be about compute. As we talked about the Global South being limited and falling further behind in education, similar to what Lavina was saying about infrastructure, it's important to call out how this technology requires large compute systems and tools. And there's two things I want to mention about that. One, the Global South maybe does not have access to this. So making sure that, as data centers are built out, we are just being more thoughtful about that. But then subsequently, calling it back to the climate concerns that come with creating these types of tools and systems. We're at the beginning phase of all this. If we continue to go on the trajectory we're on, what does that mean for our environment? I think is a very important challenge that we should probably already have discussed in other forms. And then, with the accessibility to online information to create and train this data, whether it be from social media, social listening tools, whatever it is, we're finding in the industry less and less accessibility to APIs from, let's say, Meta, X, which then requires, these systems and tools to be more reliant on synthetic data for training, not real data. The system is discerning, this is typically the word that follows this word, brick, heavy. And so it makes that inference based on how we are training the data. So I think it's important to remember that as accessibility keeps getting narrower, then we are removing people from the intelligence part of artificial intelligence. The intelligence part it's not artificial. It's based on our interactions and our intellect that we're putting into these systems and that we're putting online. And without that accessibility, then, companies are required to use synthetic data, and then more and more so, we are not in it. And lastly, I think what we could do right now is this. We're having these conversations, and I think we need to continue to do this. And I would encourage everybody here to read the white paper. It's really great. I read it on a plane. I loved it. I would encourage everyone to read it, to get involved, to reach out to me. If you have any questions, I'm always happy to hop on a phone call. And that's what I think we should focus on.
Thank you, Rebecca. Call to action and the use of being in midair to use your time well. Lavina, over to you.
Yeah, in sort of addition to what Rebecca mentioned around compute and data being one of the sort of major areas, I would probably also add surveillance. This is probably one that is underrated in the Global South just yet, but I think that's going to have a very large sort of implication, going forward, and it needs to start getting onto everyone's radar. In terms of the sort of recommendations or call to actions, I would say don't overcomplicate, because I think we're in an era where we love to overcomplicate or go into finite details. I think we just need to be, to act in a way that's very deliberate and very precise. And that's where the details come in. But when we're looking at, the regulation or the legislation or, just the overall topics, let's just keep it simple, because that kind of really sings home, a calmer message. And I think there is a large sort of FOMO out there in terms of what do we do and what don't we do, and how do we actually start approaching things. So, I guess not all of us can be superheroes, but we can definitely try in keeping things simple.
That's wonderful. That's a major life lesson and also important for us in the sector. So thank you for that concluding thought. I did want to thank our panelists again for the wonderful discussion, and everyone in the audience for joining this session. We know it's quite late for some of you, so we appreciate you taking the time to stay with us online. As I close with a few remarks, I want to flag that we will share a short survey in the chat for your feedback. We ask that each of you take 1 or 2 minutes to complete the survey before you leave the session today. This will help us to map further interest in collaboration, collect remaining questions, and gather early feedback on the white paper. This is also your chance to ask questions, share requests, or submit ideas to us. So thank you for taking the time to do that. I hope the discussion today inspires and empowers you to continue building your knowledge and advancing your ability to leverage Gen AI in a rights-respecting manner. As you heard from our experienced panelists, we're all trying to learn about this evolving topic together, and the entire DRG community must collaborate to ensure we're educating ourselves and effectively upskilling to establish the appropriate guardrails while seeking to enhance democratic outcomes. The potential opportunities to advance democratic gains will only be realized if we can establish frameworks, guardrails, and norms that promote the responsible use of these new technologies. IRI intends to continue building on this line of work. We plan to develop and release new resources and opportunities to participate in more tailored interactive trainings to build the skills of key stakeholders. Please stay tuned for updates on this work through IRI's social media feeds and our website. We look forward to working with, supporting, and learning from all of you on this topic. Thanks again from the entire Technology and Democracy team, as well as our president, for joining. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you all.